When it comes to architectural styles, many people like Colonial, Victorian, and Modern. There are some architectural styles, however, that are a bit more unique and downright bizarre. Join me for today's video as we take a look at 15 of the most unusual architectural styles. Number 15. Plattenbau. Architects are usually quite creative, and so generally speaking, even those who are looking to be efficient and create simple designs add some sort of stylistic flair. However, Plattenbau buildings stand apart for being completely devoid of anything remotely resembling creativity. Translating to slab building in English, Plattenbau is a style of prefabricated home that saw a lot of use in England, West Germany, and the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. Usually used to facilitate public housing, these buildings are quite simply slabs of concrete with rooms and windows. Often poorly built with cheap materials, these apartment blocks are free from any frills, making them efficient yet far from aesthetic. As a result, while Plattenbau were useful in solving the lack of housing in the war-damaged landscape of post-war Europe, cities now have stopped building them, and today many have been painted in bright colors in order to change their otherwise dark and depressing appearance. Number 14. Cycladic. When it comes to popularity, few architectural styles are quite as well known as Cycladic architecture. That's because while the name may sound a bit strange, the style is unique yet recognizable, as Cycladic architecture is the name given to buildings of Greece's Cyclades Islands. Including the likes of Santorini and Mykonos, these islands are fawned over by millions of tourists every single year, and these beautiful buildings certainly have a part to play. Generally consisting of whitewashed cubic houses built next to and on top of one another, their soft edges are pleasing to the eye, while simple yet eye-catching additions such as blue domes and windows give these white homes a bit of flair. While minimalistic, these buildings are also quite practical, as features such as their bright walls and small windows ensure that the interior temperatures are pretty stable all year round. So with all this in mind, I think it's fair to say that Cycladic buildings are super cool. Number 13. Fascist Architecture. Mussolini is a historical figure that's well remembered for all the wrong reasons, and while most discussions of the man revolve around his wartime blunders, perhaps his most under-discussed contribution, for better or worse, was fascist architecture. Characterized by the principles of rationalism, it was an approach that followed rigid rules that prioritized necessity and utility over beauty. Generally consisting of buildings made of reinforced concrete and few materials, fascist architecture lacked creativity by design, and unfortunately Mussolini made it his mission to build grand examples of fascist buildings around Italy. Examples of this include the Palazzo della Civiltà in Rome, which is a white cube that has become the Fendi headquarters, and the Palazzo di Giustizia, which is essentially a massive gray brick that still serves as a courthouse. While they all have received their fair share of criticism, they nonetheless inspired similar buildings in fascist Germany and Spain, and to this day many fascist buildings still stand as a testament to fascism's mantras and design choices. Number 12. Neofuturism. To neo-futurists, the future is now, and it's through this lens that they create some pretty unique buildings. In essence, Neofuturism is a school of thought that calls for aesthetics and innovation to be emphasized in order to create high-tech buildings that will pave the way for the future. First gaining steam in the 21st century, it traces its roots back to elements of the Art Deco style and Gucci movement, both of which have envisioned utopian ideals, and in the case of the Gucci movement, have a space-esque feel to them, not unsimilar to the architecture imagined in sci-fi films such as Star Trek and Star Wars. Examples of neo-futurism in action include the Nanjing International Youth Cultural Center, which has a white modern base and super futuristic and shiny blue towers that jut upwards, and the Auditorio de Tenerife in the Canary Islands, which features several strange yet aesthetically pleasing white wave-shaped walls. Given how cool these buildings are, I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to grow in popularity, and in my opinion, neo-futurism may just be the way of the future. Number 11. Postmodernism. As far as architecture goes, one of the few styles that is strange by design is postmodern architecture. First picking up steam in the late 1970s, it is a colorful and eclectic form of architecture that attempts to mishmash classic and modern styles to create buildings that look nothing like anything that's been built before. A direct response to the rigidity and rules of modern architecture, Postmodernist rejects the simplicity and sleekness of modern buildings and instead intentionally build in ways that are complicated and sometimes contradictory. One great example of postmodernism in action is the De Piramides building in Amsterdam. Completed in 2006, it's an apartment that defies convention by being designed as a blocky pyramid instead of as a far more typical large rectangular prism. Another, more famous example is the Sydney Opera House. While much of the Opera House is quite regular, the roof features massive gleaming white sail-shaped shells, which all serve to make it pop. As such, while it's difficult to give the postmodernism an exact definition, it is a style that really flourishes because of its lack of rules. Number 10. Expressionist Architecture. Art is a form of personal expression, and with Expressionist architecture, the primary goal is to evoke or express the inner sensitivities and feelings of the viewer or the architect. Developed in the post-World War era by architects with utopian and often socialist mindsets, the style is characterized by its use of novel materials, formal innovation, and very unusual massing, with this sometimes being inspired by natural biomorphic forms and sometimes by new technical possibilities offered by mass production of brick, steel, and glass. A good example of the art form is the Dancing House in Prague. Completed in 1996, it's a home that appears to move, as it essentially is a glass tower that narrows at half its height and is supported by curved pillars, with this tower then being covered by 99 concrete panels of varying shapes and dimensions in order to make the concrete look like it had been warped. A further example of this is the Gute Annum in Switzerland. While cast from concrete, the building has several strange shapes and angles that wind harmoniously into one complex, allowing it to be both functional and aesthetically pleasing. As such, this style's creativity certainly makes it unique. Number 9. Brutalism. As the name suggests, brutalist buildings are, well, pretty brutal. The central tenet of brutalism is that it's characterized by minimalist constructions that showcase the bare building materials and structural elements over decorative design. In other words, they are buildings that, while often full of various shapes, are generally made completed out of concrete and have little to no color. First made popular during the post-World War II era, they generally feature blocky designs and have a rigid geometric appearance, and in most cases, brutalist buildings have been made to house institutions and public housing. The Boston City Hall in Boston, Massachusetts, the Royal National Theatre in London, and Robarts Library in Toronto are all examples, and as you might expect, this rather bare-bones architectural style has its fair share of critics. Many accuse the building of being cold, soulless, and imposing, representing the stark lack of creativity and inspiration that many believe characterizes modern societies. However, there are others that say these buildings are true works of art that challenge our definitions of beauty, and that at certain angles they can really be quite beautiful. In any case, feel free to share your take in the comments section about this brutalist architectural style. Number 8. Igloo Architecture. The Inuit people of Alaska, northern Canada, and Greenland are famous for their igloos, and while they may seem basic to some, they're actually an extremely ingenious form of architecture. Generally speaking, they are houses made of snow and ice that use ice cubes to create a dome shape, with this dome having access to the outdoors via a small tunnel. This small entranceway and the insulating power of the snow works wonders, as while the outside temperature in the areas can be often about -45 degrees Celsius, the thermal effect of the design ensures that the inside temperatures can often be as high as 16 degrees Celsius. This is possible because the domes create a thermal envelope that in effect traps heat, and while the tiny entranceway and tightly packed snow around the structure help minimize heat loss. In any case, it's precisely thanks to its extremely effective design that igloos have been the standard home of many Inuit for thousands of years, seeing widespread use as everything from quickly made makeshift hunting shelters to long-lasting semi-permanent dwellings made for family living or community celebrations. And while now they are generally only used as emergency shelters, igloos still have a special place in the hearts of the Inuit. Number 7. Tiny homes. In today's economy, it can be tough to afford a standard suburban home, and as a result, many young people are deciding to downsize and make use of tiny homes. While there are no defined standards, tiny homes are generally between 100 and 400 square feet and attempt to maximize space as much as possible so that multiple features can fit into a small amount of space without things feeling super cramped. First popularized after the financial crisis of 2008, these homes are generally found in rural areas, and while all designs are different, they tend to follow a relatively consistent design. The California cabin by the Tiny Smart House Company is a prime example. Small enough to be towed by a regular truck, its largest feature is its kitchen, while a living room and bedroom are combined in one, while additional spaces such as an office and storage area are accessible in lofts close to the roof. Beyond their size, the other great thing about tiny homes is that they have a very small carbon footprint, as their economical size and often green, solar-powered appliances ensure that those that live in them are as environmentally friendly as possible. So while tiny homes were a style created out of an economic necessity, they're also a net benefit to society at large. Number 6. Recyclable. Generally speaking, once a building is built, that's it. It's there to stay until a decision is made to knock it down. However, in the past few years, the ball has gotten rolling on creating buildings that can be moved and repurposed so they can be rebuilt elsewhere once their time in one place is up. The Ras Abu Aboud Stadium is a perfect example of this in action. You see, in preparation for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, the country was required to build several stadiums in order to gear up for the event. However, in a country like Qatar, much of the interest in soccer isn't large enough for those stadiums to see much use after the World Cup is over, and in normal circumstances, many would likely fall into relative disuse. In order to combat this, Qatar decided to get a bit experimental by opening up a stadium that could be shipped off once the games are over. Set to seat up to 40,000 fans, this stadium stands apart for being made out of 974 shipping containers and recycled steel. And the plan is that once it hosts a total of 7 matches, it will be torn down and transported either as one of a 40,000-seat venue or 2 20,000-seater venues to countries in need of sporting infrastructure. Given how efficient the use of materials is, I just hope that other countries will consider making similar facilities when they decide to host a sporting event. Number 5. Metabolism. Japan is a country that's known for its cutting-edge innovation, and so it makes sense that they were the birthplace of the unique metabolism style. Popularized during the late 1950s and the entirety of the 1960s, it's roughly related to the human body, with the idea being that these buildings are composed of a series of living cells. While these cells would together make up a building, the futuristic idea was that the individual cells would be able to be replaced whenever they became out of date, allowing these buildings to not be static, but instead constantly be in a state of motion and development. And while physically knocking down cells never really became a common occurrence, metabolism architecture nonetheless became an accepted style for bringing about the way of the future, and soon buildings filled with cube cells were popping up across the world. Of these, one of the most famous examples was created in the Canadian city of Montreal in 1967, known as Habitat 67. It was built for an international expo held in the city in that same year, and stands apart due to its intended purpose of limiting suburban sprawl by giving urban apartments a suburban feel. This is because each cube had the roof of an adjacent cube act as its backyard, giving the whole structure a symbolic yet private feel. In any case, despite their cool, innovative designs, metabolism faded away in the early 1970s, and it's now been replaced with a different form of modern architecture. Number 4. Adaptive reuse architecture. As cities continue to grow in size, one simple reality that they often face is that some buildings start to go out of use. And while demolition and rebuilding is often the path taken by developers, more environmentally and culturally sensitive architects often advocate for the implementation of an adaptive reuse style. The core idea behind this school of thought is that culturally significant buildings that are of no use don't need to have their exteriors torn down, and that instead their interior can be repurposed in a way that's useful to the community. Examples of this include converting an old church into an apartment building, an old train station into a restaurant, or an old windmill into an office space, and the technique has a lot of interesting advantages. Beyond just maintaining cultural heritage, this style often limits urban sprawl, as it allows developers to make use of existing real estate via renovations rather than purchasing new real estate farther from expensive city centers. It also lowers construction costs due to the fact that the exterior is already in place, and it simultaneously speeds up construction because less steps have to be taken to convert the space than to completely rebuild it. To top all this off, this style of architecture is often popular with local communities, as it maintains their heritage and charming looks, rather than gentrifying them and totally changing their unique character. As a result, I hope that adaptive reuse architecture continues to become more popular as time goes on. It's a pretty cool thing. Number 3. Art Nouveau. While buildings generally stand apart for being human-inspired bastions of creativity, or lack thereof, Art Nouveau style changes things up by looking back to nature for inspiration. First coming into being in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Art Nouveau was popularized by the 1900 Paris Exposition Universelle, and from there it soon spread throughout the rest of Europe and the United States. The idea behind it was to break from tradition and explore newer, freer forms of visual expression, and as a result, some of its hallmarks include organic shapes, arches, curving lines, and sensual ornamentation, with common motifs including leaves, flowers, vines, insects, animals, and other natural elements. In order to give an added stylistic flair, these buildings tend to also feature intricate mosaic work, stained and curved glass, and decorative wrought iron, and as such, they all tend to look very different from one another. One classic example of Art Nouveau in action is the Casa Batlló in Barcelona. It stands apart due to the fact that it has a skeletal quality similar to that seen with old tree trunks, with bands of color and oddly shaped windows also giving it a bit of extra flair. On the other hand, an Art Nouveau building that takes things in a totally different direction is the Secession building in Vienna, which is completely white, save for the interesting features such as its dome of gold leaves and its tasteful nods to antiquity throughout. And while Art Nouveau mostly died out after World War I, it's nevertheless an extremely unique and influential style. Number 2. The McMansion Style. As more and more people begin to filter into the upper classes, there's been a growing demand for mansions that demonstrate this newly acquired wealth. And while many mansions use tasteful, stylistic choices, one of the most universally hated phenomena to have become its very own style is that of the McMansion. Defined by its lack of real defined style, McMansions are essentially large homes that blend together multiple styles in ways that don't properly integrate their environment. As put by the popular McMansion Hell subreddit, their most defining characteristic is that they are, quote, built by cutting corners and using less than quality materials because they focus on getting as much size and appearance of wealth as possible from their money, end quote. As a result, they often have colors that don't integrate well with the scenery around them, are too large for the plot of land that they're on, have design choices that are more grotesquely frivolous than they are aesthetically pleasing, and they're all in all built to impress due to their size rather than their looks. Generally speaking, they're found in new money suburbs of the United States, and for those with a nose for architecture, they're a sign of the excesses of the wealthy. However, despite the criticism, there are also some who like the mixes of style that go into these homes, while others complain that those who dislike McMansions are just architectural snobs. Regardless, no matter how you see it, I think it's fair to say that the McMansion style has created its fair share of controversy. Number 1. Sustainable Architecture. As the Earth continues to warm up thanks to a bit of global warming, there have been growing calls to create buildings that lower rather than exacerbate the average carbon footprint. And while these designs that make up sustainable architecture are quite broad, there are several features in many of these new buildings that have upgraded the efficiency and environmental friendliness of various buildings. For example, at One Central Park in New York, you can not only find a 50-meter-long vertical garden that's the largest in the world, but also a water treatment system that takes water from sources such as the rain, roof runoff, stormwater, groundwater, and sewage, cleans it using a massive membrane bioreactor, and then distributes it to the residents. If you go across to the Atlantic and to the city of Milan, the Palazzo Lombardia houses an even more innovative technology, the climate wall. housing what is known as a solar shading system. The wall works by not only harnessing natural sunlight in order to optimize internal temperatures, but also by functioning as a thermal buffer zone that makes it easier to both heat and cool the building. However, while it's generally only developers that can pay for such expensive features, there are some sustainable architects that make extremely low-impact buildings on a budget. For example, at the Nogler House in New Brunswick, Wynne and Janice Nogler were able to save money by creating a super-efficient home. That's because by having features such as an HRV ventilation system with a 92% heat recovery rate and a design that essentially turns their home into a heat-trapping thermal envelope, they spent just $20 more per square foot than they would on a typical home, but in the process cut their heating bill from the local average of $2,100 a year to just $77. So, all of these buildings stand as a testament to the fact that sustainable architecture can be made with all sorts of technologies and price ranges in mind. Thank you to our channel members.